So now that we've gone over the various positions and their relationships to each other, we want to turn our attention specifically to the first argument that Rachel gives us in this chapter. And I'm going to give it in a slightly more elaborate form than Rachel does, but it's a form that makes sort of explicit the kinds of things that he considers to be important to this argument. And then we'll look at Rachel's evaluation of that argument and then his argument against moral relativism on other grounds. So Rachel tells us that the relativist wants to argue from the cultural differences position, the recognition that there are different values across different cultures and across times, going from that descriptive moral relativism to argue for the truth of meta-ethical moral relativism, and from there to argue for the truth of normative moral relativism. So we'll give an argument that kind of connects those dots, descriptive view to the meta-ethical view to the prescriptive view. So let's go ahead and in the next two slides sort of spell that out in terms of a set of assumptions and conclusions. So we start off, R1, our first premise in this argument, is just the assumption that descriptive moral relativism is a true, accurate description of the practices of various cultures across time. So different cultures, in fact, have different moral codes with regard to the same action, and different time periods reflect different moral codes with regard to the same action. The second premise asserts that those differences in moral codes, those different moral practices that we find in cultures, are not, for the most part, accidental, but they're based on different moral values, so that one culture has one moral value, another culture has a different moral value, and those different moral codes reflect the basis that they have in different moral values within those cultures. And then the third assumption is really sort of drawing those first two assumptions together and saying, look, if in fact it's true that we find that different cultures have different practices, different moral codes, and we find that those different moral codes follow from different moral values, then we want to conclude that there can be no rational reconciliation of these moral codes. There can be no shared consensus that's developed through reasoned debate, because when we look at these codes, they follow from moral values, but moral values are irrational. That is, moral values are not the sort of things that we make through rational choices. So you can think about, for instance, your taste in music as being like this. So you may really like, I don't know, headbanger music from the 70s. And I may really hate headbanger music from the 70s. But nothing about your preferences, no reasons that you can give me are going to or are likely to make me go, oh, now suddenly I realize that I really like this stuff too. I might come to like it from listening to it, just like I might come to like the taste of, say, blueberry or like eggplant. But it's not something that you can give me reasons that compel me to agree with you about it. Nothing that you can do to sort of change my mind about my values in this way. It's a claim about moral values. We're not going to evaluate it specifically, but it plays an important part in this argument. So we start with descriptive moral relativism. We then argue that differences in moral codes follow from different moral values. Then we argue that different moral values have no intrinsic basis for reaching consensus in the nature of reality. Then in our fourth premise here, we have moral values are what make those moral judgments true or false. So not only do they have different moral codes, but what makes those moral codes the correct code as opposed to the incorrect code in some particular culture is that those moral codes reflect the moral values of that culture, And of course, because those moral values can't be reconciled, there's no basis for coming to some objective agreement or consensus across cultures, then if you have different moral values, you're going to have different moral judgments. You're going to have different codes that are rendered correct or incorrect relative to those cultures, relative to the values that those cultures share in common. Since there can't usually be a rational reconciliation between differing moral values, then that premise R4 tells us that moral values are what make moral judgments true, and hence different societies are going to have different moral truths. So we've gotten to meta-ethical moral relativism. The only factors that make moral judgments true or false are features that are intrinsic to specific cultures, and hence the truth or falsity of those judgments is relative to those cultures. And in particular, we're putting our finger on this notion of moral values. We're saying, look, moral values are things that are shared by cultures, but they're not things that can be objectively debated. Hence, the truth of a moral judgment will depend on a moral value. That moral value will be something the culture shares, but not something that we have any reason to suppose can be agreed upon objectively. And from that, then we make the inference to normative moral relativism. So what ought we to do? How ought we to be guided in our ethical and moral activities? Well, we ought to seek out the codes that reflect the moral values of the societies in which we are enmeshed, and then we should act in accordance with the norms that are determined by the moral judgments that are rendered true given the moral values intrinsic to that culture in which we're ensconced. So one way of thinking about that is, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So there's our argument. It goes from descriptive moral relativism to infer the truth of meta-ethical moral relativism, and from there to infer the truth of normative moral relativism. That's our argument. So how's Rachel going to respond to this argument? Well, he thinks that we don't inevitably have to follow the moral relativist from descriptive moral relativism to meta-ethical moral relativism and ultimately to normative moral relativism. In fact, he wants to argue that we shouldn't do that. He wants to argue that this argument that we've just looked at isn't a good argument. It's going to be both, in his view, invalid, and it's going to have false premises. And he's going to want to offer up an argument that it's independent. We have independent reasons for supposing that meta-ethical moral relativism is false. We should also note, right, that meta-ethical skeptics also base argument for their view on descriptive moral relativism. So even if we accept descriptive moral relativism, we don't necessarily have to follow the meta-ethical moral relativists to conclude that their view is correct and then to conclude that their normative view is correct. Instead, we could become meta-ethical skeptics and deny that there are any facts to be known, and hence that we can't know any true moral judgments, and hence there are no correct moral principles that could be used to guide our action, or at least we can't know them. In the next section, we're going to want to look at how Rachel spells out his criticisms of this argument, and then we'll finish the lecture by looking at his argument that on independent grounds we have reasons to reject meta-ethical moral relativism as a correct theory about the nature of moral judgments.